All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the next unit in U.S. history. This is on protest movements. The time frame we're talking about here is 1960 through about 1980, mostly in the late 60s and early 70s. And this is a time frame where people, because of a lot of things happening in the U.S., as we've seen, the Vietnam War, the Cold War, lots of things were happening. Huge numbers of young people because of the baby boom, started to really think about the situation that was in America and how America was operating, and where they wanted to make some changes. And a lot of those were done through protesting. The Vietnam War was one of the major pieces of that, but other things, as we'll see, were important to people too. So we had rights for women, we had rights for the environment, we had rights for different minorities. And this was really a theme throughout the 60s and 70s and all into about 1980, where people were really, trying to advocate for change of American society that they felt had kind of stagnated. So let's take a look and see what was going on during this time frame. All right, so as I said, we have a number of different things that people are fighting for or protesting or trying to make change on. And really the first one, besides civil rights that we talked about a couple of units ago, was the anti-war protests. So Vietnam, as we've seen, divided the country. Lots of people felt that it was an unjust war that was killing Americans needlessly, and this was an impetus for fighting for change. And so the anti-war protests were some of the first early and large protests that we saw during this time frame. But we also saw a number of other things. Equal access based on race and based on gender, and that led into rights for women. The women's movement was big during this time. The desire for over half of our population to have the same rights as men became very, very powerful. Hispanic rights was a new part of the civil rights movement that started during this time frame, and also Native American rights. I mean, the first Americans that had been here for thousands of years really felt like they had been mistreated for hundreds of years and wanted to have some rights. And then also rights for the planet. Environmental issues became large in the late 60s and early 70s as well. So let's start off with the student movement. Student movement we had a new generation, as I said, of students that were very active. We had a huge number of people that were in the kind of in the 60s and 70s had made it into the university era because of the baby boom. So troops came back from World War II. They started families. Lots and lots of kids were born. Those kids all worked their way into college into the late 60s and early 70s, and they had ideas. They wanted to change kind of the world a little bit. And so we had a very active group of students and a large group of students. And oftentimes they would organize, and one of the big organizations around the world was called SDS, or Students for a Democratic Society. And this was a pretty militant group that was really fighting for stopping the war, had lots of on-campus protests, and those looked different. So we had protests could be marches, it could be speeches, but it also could be things like teach-ins or sit-ins, where students would actually go and occupy a building and not let other people into it, not let the administration back into the administration building or whatever it may be, in order to make their point. This came to a head at the 1968 Democratic National Convention, which took place in Chicago. Huge number of students descended upon Chicago to try to make the point that they wanted out of Vietnam. The police in Chicago were very rough with them. We had a number of different riots, and it was one of the things that allowed the rest of the country to really look at what was happening with the students and what their demands were. Also, during this time frame, we had something called counterculture, and the counterculture were really a group of people who, rather than wanting to kind of take on traditional culture and change it, they really wanted to opt out, kind of just step away from traditional culture and distance themselves from it and do their own thing and really kind of look at life differently and not get stuck into the 9-to-5 rat race that was American life, and live in a different way that they felt was more pure and more honest and more real. This group was, kind of generalized as hippies, and so when you hear the word hippies, this is what we're talking about. A number of different things were happening with these groups. Sometimes they were living communally, so like large group organizations of people living together either in like farms or ranches or in larger homes in the cities, not nearly as worried about the traditional family kind of dynamic as they had in the past. Drug use, while it wasn't 100%, obviously this was a big piece of the hippie movement too, because drugs were seen as a way to kind of opt out of society, to see things differently, to open the doors to a new perspective of life. And so drug use was important in the counterculture movement too. And also bringing in new religious movements, and especially Eastern religions. So the religions of Buddhism and Hinduism became very popular in Western countries, including the United States, because it was a different way of looking at the world. And so counterculture was very, very important, and obviously a lot of the music that we associated with the 1960s and 1970s was associated with the counterculture movement too. Speaking of music, one of the most important things that happened in terms of a specific event was something called Woodstock. So Woodstock was a music festival that happened in August of 1969. It was billed as 3 days of peace and music. It took place on a farm in upstate New York, and over 400,000 people ultimately attended this festival. The festival organizers were not at all expecting that number of people. The weather was really bad. They didn't have enough sanitation. They didn't have enough food. But people came together, and it was really an opportunity to see that this was a large-scale movement. This was not just a couple of crazy, people off of college campuses that were doing stuff, but this was a large group of young people that wanted to do something different, wanted their life to be something different than what their parents looked like. And in addition to that, Woodstock also, just from a musical standpoint, was really a showcase of some of the great artists of the time. So you had Janis Joplin, you had the Grateful Dead, you had The Who, you had Jimi Hendrix, you had a number of different artists that were there to play, and all were kind of looking at this new way of living. So, in addition to kind of anti-war things, we talked about the fact that there were individual groups of people in American society that wanted to try to increase their rights too. And one of the largest groups, obviously by percentage, is women. Women had traditionally in American life been relegated to second-class citizens. It wasn't until 1920 that they even had the right to vote. In the 1950s, the dynamic was very much that the man goes to work and the woman stays home and raises the kids, and women didn't want that anymore. They wanted to have an opportunity to make their life however they wanted it, and have the same rights as men. And so, again, this started with World War II. If you remember back from our conversations then, we had Rosie the Riveter, we had women that were working in jobs. There was a taste of that and a desire to continue that. And when those soldiers came back from World War II, we kind of reverted back to more traditional roles, and many women didn't want that. And they were fighting against, like I said, that traditional idea of the good woman is the wife and the mother. And there's certainly nothing wrong with that, but women also wanted to have opportunities beyond that too. Specifically in the workplace, they wanted something that looked like equality. So they wanted to be paid the same. They wanted to have the same opportunity to have jobs. They wanted to be represented the same in corporations and administrative positions. And so a lot of movement was made during this time frame. We're not there yet with women's rights, but we've made a lot of movement in the right direction. And an organization that came together that was very effective in helping and going forward with the feminist movement was called NOW. That's the National Organization of Women. Some of the issues that NOW and other parts of the feminist movement looked at was, as I said, equal pay. And there was an Equal Pay Act that was passed during this time frame that said essentially for federal jobs, for government jobs, you had to pay a man and a woman the same for the same amount of work. Also, Civil Rights Act was passed, and this had a whole bunch of really important pieces of it, parts of it, chapters of it, if you think about it, which were called titles. And two of them were Title VII, which was an anti-workplace discrimination. You couldn't discriminate against people based on their gender in the workplace. And then also Title IX. And Title IX said you couldn't discriminate against people in educational settings. Okay, so women had the same right to go to universities as did men. Also during this time frame was the issue of choice. Abortion became a huge issue of the rights for women. Many people felt that women should have control of their own bodies, and until the baby was born, they should have the right to abort that fetus if that was important to them. And many people felt that that was not appropriate for either religious grounds or other grounds, that they wanted to make sure that that baby was protected. But in a very important Supreme Court case called Roe v. Wade, it was upheld that women had the right to abortions. This is still an issue, obviously, that's very important to us today and is still being fought right now. Also, the Equal Rights Amendment. This was a proposed amendment to the Constitution that was started back in the 1970s to put in the Constitution essentially a statement saying that men and women had to be treated equally. This was never passed. It was never ratified by the appropriate number of states, but the idea of the ERA was really important in the feminist movement. In addition to women, Hispanic Americans were becoming more and more a percentage of the population, and they were also fighting for rights. We had a huge increase in the population of Hispanics during this time frame. A lot of that was in farm labor, and they wanted to make sure that they had the same rights for pay and for benefits that other Americans did. They were represented by something called the United Farm Workers, and a guy named Cesar Chavez, who was really important in making this a national issue and mobilizing Hispanic vote, because ultimately Hispanics as a population block tended to be less well off monetarily than did white Americans, and so they felt that their power was really through the vote, and the vote was really important for them to get a lot of rights, especially in the state areas. So the states of California, lots of the Southwest where we live, became places where Hispanics were fighting for their rights. And by the issue of bilingualism, the fact that we have multiple languages spoken in America and we needed to deal with that, became tied into this as well. Native Americans were also a group that were advocating for their rights. An organization within the government called the Bureau of Indian Affairs had for a long time, since the 1800s, had really been the part of the U.S. government that had worked with Native Americans and Native American tribes and also the reservations, but had not done it particularly well. And Native Americans were certainly second-class citizens, and there was a lot of really shady stuff happening for them, and they wanted to move away from that. There was much more of an appreciation within the American Indian community for celebrations and traditions and the rights and important things for the tribe. That being proud of being Indian was something that came to the fore during this time frame. There was something called the Civil Rights Act for Indians that was passed, and a group called the American Indian Movement, much like NOW was an organization for women, AIM was an organization that represented the needs of the Indian population. And Indians, in a couple ways, tried to bring their issues to the fore so that the rest of America could see some of their concerns. They did this in a couple of ways. In 1969, they actually occupied the island of Alcatraz there in the bay in San Francisco to try to get attention on their rights. And then also in 1973, they took over the Wounded Knee Reservation, and there was actually some violence with FBI agents that also brought this issue to the fore. The environmental movement was another one that was really important. So rather than a group of people, this was really people advocating for the earth and recognizing that during this time frame, especially after World War II, there was a huge amount of construction and industry that had started in America. The economy was very strong in the 1950s, but that brought with it a lot of environmental problems. And there was a really important book that came out called Silent Spring by a scientist named Rachel Carson. And this was a book that talked about what happens with pesticides. What happens when we put pesticides on our crops? What does that do to us? What does that do to the environment? And it was really one of the first times that the majority of Americans had thought about this issue. It had a huge impact, and people started really pushing for some protections for the earth. This really culminated in the first Earth Day. We still celebrate Earth Day on April the 22nd every year, but in 1970 they had the first Earth Day with huge marches in Washington and other cities to try to bring about the idea that we collectively rely on the earth, and we collectively as a species, and specifically Americans, need to fight to make sure that it is conserved. In 1970, a new part of the federal government was brought into the fore, and that was called the Environmental Protection Agency, or the EPA, which was designed specifically to help make sure that the water, the air, the land was clean, to find businesses that took advantage of that, and to help clean up areas that had already been spoiled. And we saw a couple of large issues related to some environmental damages. One was at Love Canal, which was in the east, and it was just a horribly, horribly polluted area. Where people were getting sick that lived around it. People had to be removed from the area because of the toxic nature of the chemicals that had been there. And again, it kind of brought the attention of the American population on this, and what we needed to do to make sure that this wasn't happening in the future. We also looked at how our power is generated. So up until this point, during kind of the 1950s and 1960s, there had been a big push towards nuclear power. You know, certainly when we think of nuclear, we think of weapons, but also the nuclear science had helped us develop power plants. And they were throughout the United States, and they produced an awful lot of our power. Many people liked that because you weren't burning fossil fuels. It was something that we could create right here in America. We didn't have to import oil or fossil fuels from other parts of the world. But obviously, with anything that is nuclear, you have some pretty significant environmental and health concerns. And one of those came to pass in 1979 in a place called 3 Mile Island, where there was a meltdown, a partial meltdown of a reactor that did release some radioactive gas, and again got people thinking a little bit about what do we want to do with this. You know, is this a good way for us to generate power? The other issue was, what do we do with the nuclear waste once it's used? So these fuel rods that are radioactive have to be put somewhere after they're done. And for a long time, the place that people were going to put them was just north of where you are right now in Yucca Mountain, Nevada. And that's been fought for years. So far, it hasn't happened, but we still have to do something with all the nuclear waste that's around our country. And so these concerns really led to the fact that there have been no new nuclear power plants in the United States since 1973, and many of the ones that are existing have been shut down. So those are a couple of things that were really big in the 1960s and 1970s related to protests. Another thing that really kind of moved people was something that happened internally to our government, and that was the Watergate scandal. So during the presidency of Richard Nixon, who was, if you recall, elected in 1968 to the presidency, Nixon was a very paranoid president. He was absolutely sure that people were out to get him. He was sure that people were, trying to kind of backstab him. And so one of the things he did to make sure that that was not happening is he installed recording equipment within the White House. And this, as we'll see in just a second, kind of got back to him. So what happened with Watergate was, prior to the 1972 election, which would have been the re-election for president for Nixon, there was a break-in at the Democratic National Convention headquarters. And this was a desire to try to get information from the Democrats that could be used against them. The people that broke in had been actually paid to do this by the White House, by the Nixon administration. And when they were found and arrested, it started a chain of reaction that ultimately led to his downfall. Initially, the White House covered up the fact that these people that had broken into the Democratic National Committee building were associated with the Nixon administration. But the Senate investigated this and found that there was some credible evidence. And then what really brought him down was those tapes. So those tapes that he had made to try to make sure that he wasn't being, backstabbed really got him. Those led to impeachment hearings in the U.S. House, and ultimately Nixon resigned in 1974. And this becomes one of the very first time that a president has resigned in office. So that's a little bit about what was going on in the 60s and 70s during the protest movement, and you'll learn more as we go through this lesson.